And it looks like it's time for us to get started. So everyone on the line, welcome back to the Current Directions in Psychological Science Speaker Series presented by Pearson and APS. I am very excited to introduce our next speaker, Jeffrey Arnett, a research professor in the Department of Psychology at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. Dr. Arnett's primary scholarly interest for the past 10 years has been in emerging adulthood. He coined the term and has conducted research on emerging adults concerning a wide variety of topics, including risk and media use, involving several different ethnic groups in American society. He is the author of numerous books, including his most recent, Human Development, A Cultural Approach. And his talk today will focus on how culture shapes human development from beginning to end.
Hi, everyone. I'm looking forward to talking to you about human development, and in particular about the role of culture in shaping human development. I am a developmental psychologist at Clark University, as Nicole mentioned, and I've been a developmental psychologist for almost 30 years. And during that time, psychology has always struck me a bit as a strange field in a way, in the sense that it is the study of human behavior, and in my particular area, the study of human development. But the focus of most research on human development has been on a very small segment of the human population, mainly Americans. Most research and most researchers are American. And in spite of this focus on what is actually a really small percentage of the human population, Americans are about 4 to 5% of the total world population. There's been a tendency among researchers and scholars in psychology to study this very small group and yet make conclusions about all of humanity, the other 95% that actually aren't studied all that much. And to me, this is something that really makes psychology incomplete. And I think what I'd like to see in the future of psychology is more attention to how culture shapes human development and the marvelous diversity that exists among the world's cultures, and how it is a very different way to experience your development depending on where you happen to have been born and where you grow up. I think psychology can benefit a lot from this. I think that it's fascinating to learn about the way cultures vary around the world. It really is a marvelously culturally diverse world, and human cultures have invented a remarkable range of different ways of being human. And so I think a complete psychology has to take into account all those different ways and can really be vitalized by attention to all those different ways that cultures have of doing things and of shaping human development. There is this tendency to focus on only a relatively small proportion. Even if you add to the U.S., you had Canada, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea, which comprise the economically developed countries of the world, as they're often called. That's only 18% of the entire world population. And so even expanding research to the rest of the developed world, all these countries listed here, doesn't give you a complete sense of just how diverse the world's population is and how diverse human cultures are. And when you start to look around the world, you discover very quickly that there are vast differences in how people live, in terms of their cultural ways of life, and also in terms of the sort of demographic background that their culture is set in with respect to things like population, income, and education. And since I only have a brief time here today, I don't have time to really do a complete cultural survey. But I want to talk a little bit about these differences in population and income and education, just so you can get a sense of how different life can be around the world depending on where you are born, where you develop. Here's the population pattern. And it's really quite striking to see how it's changed in the course of the 20th century. You can see that the population of industrialized countries, the countries that I just showed you, has grown substantially in the course of the last century. But far more of the population growth of the human population has been in developing countries. And that's expected to continue. As you can see on the far right, by the year 2050, the world is expected to have 9 billion human beings. The human population is expected to reach 9 billion about 2050. And all the growth between now and 2050 is going to come in the developing countries. You can see on the bottom there with that 1.2 billion figure. That's what it was in 2000, and that's what it's projected to be in 2050, because the populations of most developed countries are not growing anymore. The population growth is occurring mainly in developing countries. So the proportion of the human population that resides in those countries is growing steadily and is going to continue to grow at least until 2050. Here's a photo from my recent visit to India. This is a preschool class in an Indian village. India is one of the countries that is expected to gain the most population in the course of the next 40 years. Their current population is 1.1 billion, and by 2050 is expected to be 1.5 billion. So in the course of just the next 40 years, they're expected to gain 400 million people. And that's really remarkable. It's more than the current population of the entire United States, which is 300 million. So it's just one more sign of how we need to go outside the borders of the United States in order to understand human development completely. Here's the income picture, and you can see how this too varies vastly between the rich countries and the rest of the world. So on the right you see the per capita income for the developed countries, the so-called OECD countries. That's a sort of club of the rich countries of the world, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And if you take the entire economy of those countries and divide it up among the number of inhabitants, it's close to $30,000 per person per year that these economies generate. And as you can see, in all of the other regions of the world, it's less than 10,000. And in the poorest regions of the world, especially sub-Saharan Africa, it's actually about 2,000 per person per year. So that shows you just how different it can be in most of the world. That highest bar, the OECD countries, the rich developed countries, is just a small proportion of the world's population. And that makes for a very different kind of life if you live in those countries than it does if you live in the rest of the world, in terms of things like your access to education, your vulnerability to disease, your life expectancy. So a lot of things that are really important in shaping human development depend on income. So we generally study the wealthier people of the world who are like these kids here. They're well fed, they're nicely dressed, they go to school, they have a place to live, they will likely stay in education for a long time. We know a lot about people like this, and almost all of our research has gone into studying people like this. People like this we don't know so well, and this is far more of the world's population. This is a photo from a visit that I made to China a few years ago. And China, of course, is a remarkable place too. Like India, it's booming economically. But like India, it's mostly still rural villagers like this family here. And you can just imagine that boy who's at the head of the group here and leading the way for his mom and his little brother. You can just imagine how different his life is likely to be than that pair that I showed you in the previous photo, because their economic opportunities and everything shaping the sort of life that they will live is likely to be affected by the income of the family in the region where they live. Here's the educational picture. Again, you find really big differences. I mean, we assume that kids go to school. I think most of us in developed countries assume this, that that's what kids do. And it's true that in most of the world, kids go to primary school. You can see how in the OECD countries, those rich countries of the world, if you look at that darkest bar, it's close to 100%. It's also close to 100% in South Asia and East Asia and Latin America. But it's actually only about 80% in the Arab states and only about 70% in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's still regions of the world where a substantial proportion of kids are not even enrolled in primary school. Now if you look at the middle bar with each region, you can see the secondary school is even more variable. So if you look on the far right and look at the middle bar for the OECD countries, you see that almost all the adolescents in developed countries go to secondary school. And that's what we're used to expecting. But in other regions of the world, it's by no means universal or even close to it. As you can see, it's about 40% in South Asia, about 60% in East Asia and Latin America, 50% in the Arab states, and just 20% of adolescents in sub-Saharan Africa are enrolled in secondary school. Again, you can just imagine how different that makes your life and how different that makes your future in terms of what kind of work you're likely to be doing in your adulthood. And finally, tertiary education is on the right. It's the far right bar for all of those regions. It's the lightest bar. And you can see that it's about 50% in the developed world. But in the rest of the world, that bar is quite low. It's 10%, 15% or below. And so in most of the world, going to college, which is what tertiary education mainly is, it's strictly for the elite, even though it's become a common experience in the developed world. Here's a picture of a girl and her little sister that I took on my trip to India. And I saw her a lot in the days we were there. We were in this town for about 2 weeks, and every day I saw her and her little sister in the neighborhood, and she was always carrying her little sister around. It was pretty clear that she wasn't going to school. It's hard to tell how old she is, but she looks about middle school age, maybe late primary school. And she apparently was already done with all the school that she was going to have. And it's hard for us to imagine in the developed world because we're used to expecting that, of course, people go to high school and that most people, at least half people, will go beyond high school as well. But that's not how most of the world lives. Now let me talk a little bit about development, about different life stages, and give some examples of the sort of cultural diversity that exists in how people experience various life stages. For infancy, one notable difference is that in most of the world, it's most common for babies to sleep alongside their mothers for the first months, maybe the first year, sometimes even the first 2 years of life. They sleep alongside their mothers. And that makes breastfeeding easy because if the child wakes up in the night, it can easily nurse because the mother is right there. And it makes for a very close attachment to the mother. Whereas in most developed countries, we have infants sleep alone from the very beginning. And there's actually quite a bit of controversy in developed countries about what's called co-sleeping, which is what all these cultures are doing, is sleeping alongside the mother. But in the debate about co-sleeping, there's a lot of debate about whether it's good or bad for infants. Is it dangerous for them? But the fact is, in the majority of the world, this is the typical cultural practice, to sleep alongside the mother. And the infants do just fine. It's not dangerous for them. In fact, it's better for their sleeping patterns and for their nutrition to sleep alongside the mother. It's not that one way of doing things are better or worse. It's just that they're different ways of doing things, depending on where you live in the world. In childhood, we, as I said, expect kids to be going to school. They, outside of school, are doing things like playing with friends, listening to music, playing sports, watching TV. But there's a lot of the world for whom life gets serious pretty early. They're caring for their younger siblings at an early age, like that girl in the photo I showed you earlier. It begins often around just age 6 or 7. They start taking care of their toddler siblings. Or they could be doing other work. They could be helping the mother in the household. They could be working in the fields. Some kids are even working in factories by the time they're 8, 9, 10 years old in developed countries. And that obviously makes for a very different kind of childhood. In terms of adolescence, as we just saw, attending secondary school is not universal, not by any means. Most of our adolescents do, but in a lot of the world, by adolescence, even if they've gone to primary school, by adolescence they'll be working to contribute to the family income because the family really needs their labor. They might be working on the family farm, they could be working in a factory, but in much of the world, adolescents are done with school and they're now working to help the family survive economically. In young adulthood, one striking difference is that a substantial part of the world has a tradition of arranged marriage, which means that the parents choose the marriage partner for the young person, for their children. And that's as opposed to what's been called the love marriage that we're used to, where two partners choose each other and the parents aren't really involved much. And arranged marriage has been a widespread tradition, including in the two most populous countries, China and India. China doesn't really have arranged marriage anymore, but in India, the majority of young people still have an arranged marriage. And they like this tradition, most of them. The research shows that they view their parents as wiser than they are, and they trust their parents to make a good choice for them. And they see this in many ways superior to a love marriage. And again, you can just think of how different this makes marriage, especially the early years of marriage. If you have an arranged marriage where you barely know the person when you get married, and parents have made a choice, versus a love marriage where in many countries, including the United States, you even cohabited first. That makes married life much different from the get-go. And again, it's not that one is better or worse than another, but there's certainly different ways of experiencing your development. And finally, one more example. In late adulthood, in the developed world, like the United States and Europe and those other countries I showed you at first, we expect that eventually people will be able to retire. They'll make enough money, they'll have enough income through a Social Security program, plus maybe some kind of pension, plus their own savings and investments, to retire by the time they're around age 60 or 65, and then have a long retirement where they don't have to work. But that's still the exception around the world. Because most of the world is poor, most of the world doesn't have pension programs in late adulthood. So when people reach late adulthood and they can no longer work, then they are dependent on their families, and they usually live with their children and grandchildren. And there's some good things about this. Often children in those families are very close to their grandparents. But it's a mixed bag. It's a thing that differs among countries and cultures. And for people who have a pension who live independently in the developed world, they mostly prefer to live that way. They prefer not to live with their children. It's a different kind of cultural tradition. So let me conclude by just making a few observations on what I view as the importance of taking the cultural approach to human development in research and in how we teach students. I really think that it's important to teach students about the whole world when we're teaching them human development. I find that they love it. They love learning about cultures that are different than their own. It deepens their understanding of their own lives. And I also think the cultural approach is essential if we're to understand how people develop. We can't just look at one way of doing things. We have to look at the marvelous diversity in how cultures shape human development in order to really understand how people live. And I think this is more important than ever before, now that there is so much migration and globalization. That's been a striking thing about recent decades, is that people move more within and between countries than ever before. And so even if you're in the United States and you never travel beyond the United States, in the course of your life, you're likely to have a contact with a lot of people who are from different cultures. The United States has had a huge wave of immigration in the course of the last 20 years, especially from the Latin American countries and Asia. And so throughout the United States, we and our students are likely to have contact with a wide range of people who have different cultural backgrounds in the course of our lifetime. And so it's important for us in a practical sense to understand how people are different and the variation that can exist in cultural ways of doing things. I think it can make us more accepting of cultural differences if we have that view of things. And so I think even an understanding of Americans is incomplete without a cultural context. Even if you didn't come into contact with many people who are not American, it would be really useful to understand cultural context. And let's just go back to the marriage example for a minute as one example. If you want to understand American marriages, I think it's very useful to understand that this is only one way of doing marriage. There is this long tradition of arranged marriage in other cultures. And now that we've developed love marriage, especially in the course of the last couple of 100 years, it does make for a lot more freedom, of course, in choosing your life partner. But it also puts a lot more emotional weight on the marriage relationship. In countries like India, where there are arranged marriages, people value marriage very much, but they don't look for all of their emotional needs and all their emotional satisfaction to be rewarded in marriage. They put more emphasis on other family relationships and friendships and so on. So again, it's not that one way is better than another. It's that understanding a variety of ways can help us all to understand our own lives better and the lives of the people that we have relationships with and come into contact with in the course of our lives. So just one more comment to wrap things up. I love psychology. I'm very happy that I became a psychologist. And I say that because that's true even though I view psychology as really an incomplete field in having focused so much on Americans and in giving so little attention to the rest of the world. But I think it's important to remember that psychology is still a very young field. It's really only a little over 100 years old, and the research base of it only really got going in the course of the last 50, 60 years. So it still is a very young field, and I'm hopeful that in the future, in the course of the 21st century, it will become more broad culturally, and that by the end of the 20th century, we'll have a much better developed field in terms of our cultural understanding of it and what we see as the cultural basis of human development. I think then we'll have a broader and deeper understanding of who we are. And I think it begins with students. I think it's important to teach students how to think culturally, because they are, many of them, the future psychologists of tomorrow and the future researchers of tomorrow. And I think if they go into it with a cultural view of things and a cultural approach to human development, that will influence the questions they ask and the people they study. Thank you, and I have enjoyed talking to you, and I hope you enjoy your conversation.
The question now is, how do you bring this exciting new information into your courses? We'll now turn it over to our master teacher, Christine Ziegler, for our interactive Q&A. Dr. Ziegler teaches at Kennesaw State University in Georgia. She is the faculty advisor for the psychology club there and is particularly interested in working with students in developing and implementing their own research. Let's get started with our first question related to the human development course, which is, my class includes a wide variety of majors, not all psychology. What are your suggestions for making the material relevant to all students taking my lifespan course?
Well, I think that's pretty common because the developmental course is a prerequisite in a lot of other majors. So in my classes, I get a lot of nursing majors and a lot of education majors. And obviously we get our SEG majors as well, but what I try to do is to ask questions or to provide information that's specific to those disciplines. So, for instance, when we're talking about Piaget and the reality of a 3-year-old, I say to the class, so if you were a nurse and a child had had a bad experience with dad fixing the clock, and then you say to that child, the doctor's going to fix you, they immediately recognize, oh, that's how this applies. Same thing with education. I think with education, it's even more straightforward. It's very easy to connect human development to education and to nursing. And we also have our sociology majors who kind of intuitively recognize that the disciplines are very similar along those lines. So I just make it a point to try and get information from my students about what their majors are, and then design questions and ask and provide materials that are relevant to a wide variety of different majors.
Okay, thanks. Our next question is from a student, and the question is, as a first-year student in a master's program for professional counseling, how can I start becoming more culturally competent now so that I may better help the diverse populations I will be working with in the future?
Well, it's probably important to know which diverse cultures you might be seeing the most. I highly recommend 4 languages as a good starting point, and certainly approaching the cultural literature is going to be a major issue in terms of keeping up with, particularly if you're going into therapy, the burgeoning literature about being sensitive culturally in therapeutic situations. So that literature is all over the place. I also think having language, a 4 language is a really excellent way to prep yourself for being able to communicate effectively with a diverse group, and certainly keeping right on top of your field and what's going on culturally is going to be critical to your success.
Okay, great. And sticking with the topic of culture, I have a professor here who's asking, due to time restrictions, every culture obviously can't be discussed for every topic. So how do you pick and choose which cultures to cover?
Well, I take some time in the first class to go through a little getting to know each other exercise, where I ask everybody to give their name and one thing they'd like the rest of the class to know about them. And I start out the whole process myself by giving them a little background and telling them one thing that I think they might be interested in knowing about me. What happens then is, as the people, as the various students go through this little exercise, we discovered that those of a lot of the folks who are coming to us from different cultures think that that's the thing that everybody would like to know about them. So we get to hear right away in that very first class that we've got a wide variety of cultures represented in the class. I then asked those folks if they'd be willing to serve as our sort of expert in that area when we start talking about various topics that may be very subject to cultural diversity. So, for instance, when we get to parenting, parenting is one of the things where there's a lot of literature about cultural differences, and once people are invited to actually provide their perspective from their culture, I find that it gets really lively, that students really enjoy sharing that information and having people recognize that not everything's the same in all cultures. And I find it's well worth the time that we spend doing that.
Okay, our next question is from an instructor, and the question is just what are some easy ways I can keep current with the research without changing my textbook every year?
One of the ways that I do that is to go out to the various websites that specifically speak about human development and culture and look at the articles, the short articles that are available. They are everywhere. It doesn't require that you subscribe to a particular journal. What it just requires is that you get out there, once in a while and look at what's been going on, and you'll find that there's a wealth of information available on the web. It tends to be, you have to be able to sort through what's reliable and what's not, but for most instructors that's not a difficult task, and there are some really good websites. I'd be happy to provide that information if I can send it to folks. And the other thing is just being current on what's going on in the news is also something that I can bring to class, because typically there are cultural items every single day that you can integrate into class discussion.
Thank you. And so the next question, I think, could be applied to many different classes, but it's fundamental. How do I get my students to read the book before they come to class so we can have these lively, interesting discussions?
Well, that's probably the best question I've never really fully gotten resolved myself.
Students on the webinar, do you have suggestions?
Well, there are a couple of things that I do. I do a little exercise about once a week called Psycho Jeopardy. And it's just about 3 or 4 questions that have to do with specifically what the readings were for that day. And while I don't offer any kind of incentive to do that, I find that students are really interested in, even if they're not prepared, in what people are saying. I also let people know, we're about to approach some of the most difficult material in the class. It's so much better for you if you've read it, so that you can ask questions as we go. And I also have another class, not the developmental class, where they have to submit questions about the material that they were supposed to read for the day. So you might be able to modify that as well for human development.
So I have another a professor that has a question that kind of wants to know, how do you handle, your example was very good earlier when you have the students represent an entire culture, but how do you make sure you don't marginalize just one individual's experience and generalize it to the entire culture?
Well, we have to talk about that. I mean, it's part of the research methodology that I teach in the class anyhow, is that, our personal experiences may or may not be representative. I always ask questions of anybody willing to speak to any issue. Do you think that's a common experience in your culture, or is that pretty specific to you and your family, so that we have a handle on it? But again, I always say to folks, if you're not really sure about this, you can always go out to the web and get additional information. It's kind of a neat way to get people to be looking at things. And frankly, it has worked fairly well for me. I've had several students come to me after these kinds of discussions and say, and ask me would I be willing to work with them on research looking at these specific cultural questions. So it generates student interest in terms of even doing some research to get additional information.
Okay, great. I've actually got a couple of suggestions for how to get students reading.
Yay!
One is engage students during class time. If they know they're going to be called on during class, they'll be more likely to know the material beforehand. Great idea.
Yeah.
And another one, maybe 5 to 10 point quizzes at the beginning of class will get students to read the material before class time. We've got time for one more question, and this question is from an instructor. How do I make the older adulthood years more engaging for my students?
Well, you know, that's an excellent question because I find that a lot of students just aren't really excited unless you do something to help them out. So there is some research that was done back in the 80s where they asked students, traditional age students, to give 3 words that describe older people in general. And then after they give those 3 words, they also ask them to provide an additional 3 words that would describe their own grandparents. And the research indicated in a really direct way that what people think about their own grandparents tends to be much more positive than their overall generalized view of elders. So I do that as an exercise in the class, and then I encourage people to think about these concepts and how they might apply to their own beloved grandparents. And I'm not sure how successful it is, but I do get a lot of positive feedback about that. And it does seem to make the information more relevant. So, yeah, and when we're talking about it, I always couch it in terms of, so your grandparents might be doing this instead of, you know, they may be responding a little bit differently because of central nervous system slowdown. So it's not just in general, elders do this. It's like your grandparents might be experiencing these problems. And I find that they kind of relate to that a little bit better.
Okay, great. Thanks. We have actually another suggestion for the teaching that I want to share. Try online quizzes with multiple attempts allowed. One instructor, I actually can't tell if it's a student or an instructor, but that was one suggestion for how to get students to read the book ahead of time. We're coming to the end of our session, but before we go, I want to thank Dr. Arnett and Dr. Ziegler for volunteering their time to share their research and teaching strategies. So thank you guys so much. And
thank you all.
And we're going to take a little break, and we'll return at 3 p.m. Eastern for our final session of the speaker series on scientific literacy.